So again, welcome to our first program of the 2020-2021 season for First Saturday PDX. For those of you that are new with us, First Saturday PDX is a monthly continuing education series covering a wide range of China-related topics. And today's talk, which you see on the screen hopefully, is titled Collecting Under Socialism, Philately in 1950's China. And our speaker is Dr. Wendy Larson. If by chance you joined us and you didn't intend to, you are welcome to stay. And you are also welcome to leave if you'd like. We will be, let's see. We are, again, the audience in webinar format is currently muted, and we will have a chance to, thank you very much. We will have a chance for a question and answer after the talk. Oh, excuse me. So again, so for Q&A, we're asking everyone to use the Q&A box. And so at the bottom of your Zoom screen, if you haven't used this feature before, there should be just a little icon that has little speech bubbles and says Q&A. When you click on that, it opens a little window. You can type in your question at any time during the presentation. And then when you're done, you can close that window. And you can open it and close it however many times you'd like if you have questions. And then after the talk, we're gonna have a session where we will read those questions and Wendy will answer them. And hopefully we'll get to all of them or as many of them as we can. The next one is just a quick troubleshooting. Hopefully you're hearing me talk and you're seeing the slides on the screen. Excuse me. If you can't, or if things seem a little choppy or cutting in and out, hopefully that's just the Wi-Fi kind of being a little fussy, and it'll come back in a few seconds. If not, you can also leave the webinar and come back in. That might kind of reset things. And there's also the call-in option for audio, and that call-in information can be found on your registration confirmation. And or you can click on the audio settings at the bottom of your Zoom menu bar. Just as a reminder, we are recording this presentation, so we'll be able to have it available for future viewing. So if you aren't able to stay for the whole thing, or if for some reason the Wi-Fi gets a little choppy, we will have that and you can view it later. All right, so I think that's pretty much it for our housekeeping. So I'd like to introduce Suwako Wadanabe from the Institute of Asian Studies at PSU, just to say a few words.
Hi everyone, good morning. And thank you for coming in, and also thank you for First Saturday PDX group to co-hosting this series. And I'm so glad to have Dr. Wendy Larson as the first speaker. We don't have any program, any upcoming events planned out yet. And the school is starting on September 28th. So we still have, some time to plan out. And as probably many of you know, that the PSU is going to be remote in the fall. And many people are saying that it's going to be likely to be remote in the winter again. And due to the high, population and high traffic and buildings spread it out, it's really difficult to, countermeasure the COVID situation. So I think it's safe for everyone. But anyway, we have our website, which is new, and as soon as we have a plan for the next year, we will announce it. So thank you.
Oh, and next we're going to have Dennis from our First Saturday PDX committee.
Dear friends, welcome. It's wonderful to see everybody and to welcome our new visitors. You may not realize, but it's been a long 6 months between our since we've been able to share a First Saturday program together. This is the longest hiatus between programs in our 20 years of continuing presentations. Our planning committee has missed all of you and hope that everyone is healthy and well. To celebrate our 20th anniversary, we have a special lineup of speakers. You can see on the screen a brief outline of many of the presentations. You will notice that Kevin Greenwood will be joining us with a program on a special collection of Chinese paintings at Oberlin College in Ohio. James Ben from McMaster's College in Ontario, Canada, will take us on a journey to look at 3 centuries of tea in China, focusing on preparation and enjoyment through the exploration of paintings, tea vessels, and the readings of poetry. The chief curator of the Jordan Schnitzer Art Museum at the University of Oregon will be offering us 2 programs, one in October on the reinstallation of the Chinese Gallery, and one in June 2021 that will focus on the renowned Gertrude Warner collection of textiles, of Chinese textiles, how it was collected and assembled with partnering donations. Ina Asim, which many of you may remember from past programs, will be joining Anne Kitagawa on this program. Anne Witherall will also be a participant, and her program is currently in progress. In addition, we are delighted to have new presenters. One will speak about a famous warrior in Chinese history, a warrior who is not male and who is not Mulan. Another program will highlight the history of chili peppers in China for cuisine and for healing purposes. Finally, a presentation on 18th century art in China through global mercantilism and cross-cultural trade. More information will be forthcoming, so please stand by for email announcements and by visiting our website, firstsaturdaypdx.org. Now, at this time, I'd like to ask Jennifer Lee to introduce our exciting program with our speaker and about our speaker and our program. Jennifer, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Wendy Larson is a Professor Emerita of East Asian Languages and Literature at the University of Oregon. She holds a BA from the University of Oregon and an MA from the University of California, Berkeley, where she also received her PhD in Oriental languages. A specialist of modern literature and film, Dr. Larson has published numerous books and journal articles, including From A.Q. to Lei Feng, Freud and Revolutionary Spirit in 20th Century China, Women and Writing in Modern China, Literary Authority and the Chinese Writer, and Zhang Yimou, Globalization and the Subject of Culture, which Dr. Larson previously spoke on with the First Saturday PDX. Dr. Larson has also translated Wang Meng's modernist novel, Bolshevik Salute. She co-edited Gender in Motion, Divisions of Labor and Cultural Change in Late Imperial and Modern China, and Inside Out, Modernization and Postmodernization in Chinese Literary Culture. Her present research project analyzes Chinese revolutionary optimism within both socialist and capitalist traditions during the 1950s, with emphasis on Enlightenment notions of progress and the future. We are very excited to welcome Dr. Wendy Larson back to First Saturday PDX.
Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer, and Dennis and everyone else. I'm really happy to be here and see you, even though I can't actually see you. And this is really the first time I've given this kind of a talk where I don't see the audience. So I'll do the best I can, and I hope that the slides will be visible, and we have a good question-answer period after. So this talk is going to be a little bit different than some of my other talks. It's not quite as focused. It's on a topic that has many tangents, and I'm going to follow some of those tangents for no reason other than I think they're interesting. I was, of course, interested in stamps when I was young, and I was also interested in the 1950s. I have been ever since I started studying China, and I have spoken with you before about the 1950s. And my present project is on the 1950s, on optimism and progress and notions of the future. I've been a collector really since I was very young, about 10 years old. And it was a sporadic thing. Once I started to go to college, didn't have much time, but I kept it up to some degree when I was studying in Taiwan and in China. And it's interesting that over that period of time, from when I was young until right now, the hobby has changed quite a bit in the United States. I think it's really kind of faded. It's not as prevalent as it used to be, but it's booming in China. It's absolutely a very lively hobby, and there's many, many people who engage in it. Stamp collecting can be quite time consuming, which is why we often can't do much when we're studying, but it also can be technical, and there's many aspects of collecting that are technical in nature and have to do with a kind of deep knowledge of the exact stamp and when it was put out, what kind of ink was used on it, what kind of perforations around the edges, and so on, things like this. I found that I wasn't so much interested in these technical aspects of stamp collecting. I was, and not being interested in those makes me a bit of a dilettante in the stamp collecting world. But I think I'm a serious dilettante, and I hope I'll convince you of that. I was somewhat more interested in both the history of the postal system and postage stamps and the history of collecting, which are two different things. But I found that I was even more interested in the cultural aspects of stamp collecting, or we could call it the social field, where people went about their collecting, what kind of attitudes, what kind of principles, recognized or unrecognized, were helping people organize their stamp collecting, and what sort of social interactions took place. So that turned out to be my my long-term interest on this, and that's kind of the approach that I've used when I've tried to go forward and make this a more academic topic. It may surprise you that there are debates about collecting stamps. You may have thought to yourself, what a strange and certainly a very innocent hobby. There can't be anything wrong with it, but it, I think, was a surprise to me as well that stamp collecting was continually regarded as a suspicious hobby through the 1950s. And it is a hobby that many people worried about because it seemed to lead collectors to unsavory habits and even addiction. Now, addiction, I think, is something we all can understand when it comes to any kind of hobby. Possibly the current post office debate in the United States makes this somewhat more relevant, even though that's not really focused on stamps. So this talk is based on a short article that I published in the China Clipper, which is the journal of the China Stamp Society. And it really deals with how stamp collecting was forced to deal with a new culture after 1949. Like everything else, 1949 being the first year of the People's Republic of China. Now, some of this new culture was quickly adopted and shown on stamps in the theme of the images. And so, as you would expect, national construction, things like agricultural development and industrialization, images related to the construction of new China almost immediately appeared on stamps. Does that show? I hope it shows. Okay. This stamp is a land reform stamp from 1952. And if you look at all the images that are included on this stamp, you see that there's a very large tractor in the background that is a bit out of proportion with the rest of the images. And it's so large, this image of mechanized agriculture, and underneath it, we have the ox and several people using a hoe. And we can certainly see that this tractor is going to run right over them. And so I think the suggestion here is that this kind of mechanized agriculture is taking over. In the front, we have three people. They're dressed mostly like peasants, and we have two men and one woman. And the man on the right there is pointing, I think, toward the tractor and sort of showing the way, how things are going to go. The political message, of course, is here as well. The land reform, it says on the right, displayed on the right in Chinese characters, which is actually a political movement of taking, in the early 1950s, of taking land away from landlords and returning it to the people who actually till the land. So here we have a stamp commemorating a political movement, but also a kind of idea, an idea of things changing in the direction of mechanization. Now, there's also a lot of stamps that have very overt political messages on them. And in 1959, this stamp, it's one of my favorite stamps, actually, commemorating the 10th year after the founding of the People's Republic of China was issued. And so if you look at this stamp carefully, you can see on the left a group of people. In the center, Mao Zedong is giving a talk in Tiananmen, and there are 4 microphones in front of him. There's also a lantern hanging down there from the top and several lanterns along to the left. It's based on this painting, which was done in 1953 by Dong Xiwen. There's actually 3 different versions of this painting, and this is the first one. The third one was similar, and I'll talk about the second one in a moment. As you can see, the stamp and the painting on which it is based have, very clear political references, and they also have a fascinating kind of quirky cultural and political background. So if we put them both together, the painting and the stamp, you can see they're very similar. They look really quite identical. The number of microphones has changed. In the painting, there's 2 microphones, and in the stamp, there are 4. But, working under the pressure of changing political times, the stamp artist actually had to erase one of the figures on the left. And this was the discredited Vice President Gao Gang, who was expelled from the Communist Party and committed suicide in 1954. So we can take a look here a little bit more close up. And you see the people there. And in the version, this is the second version. Or I'm sorry, the one on the right is the stamp and the one on the left is the painting. And the last person on the right has been replaced by a flower pot. So you see next to the man with the long beard, in the painting, there's actually someone there. And in the stamp, that person has disappeared. So this is Gao Gang, who committed suicide. So you can see that what happened is that the painting was done in 1953. The stamp came out in 1959, and then there was a new painting done in which the person was, the first painting, the Gao Gang is there. In the second painting, he's eliminated, and in the third painting, he comes back again. So the artist had to do this over and over. So this is just a kind of a little interesting sidebar in order to hopefully intrigue you a little bit about stamps. There's a lot of intrigue in stamp collecting and in stamps themselves. So by the early 1960s, this kind of closely political stamp gave way to a brief period of kind of traditional cultural appreciation. And we can see that, for example, in these goldfish stamps from 1960. These stamps are much in demand now. The political stamps are also very much in demand. And if you look carefully at these stamps, there's some writing at the bottom in the white part, the white margin there. And you can't read it probably, but there are a bunch of characters down there. And what this does is give the number of the stamp in the Chinese postal system, that has its own internal numbering for stamps. It tells which stamp it is in the series, and it gives other information about the stamp. So this was common to all Chinese stamps in the contemporary period after 1949, with one exception. So as we move on to the Cultural Revolution, which started in 1966, radically political stamps became the norm, like this one, which says, Chairman Mao is the red sun in the hearts of the revolutionary people of the world. But also for stamp collectors, you see that the bottom numbers, the numbering and the little characters that appear in the white margin at the bottom are simply gone. And that is because these things were deemed to be no longer important. The only thing that was important was the message and the image on the stamp and the message that comes out of the image and out of the characters. Now, there's also quite a bit of intrigue in Cultural Revolution stamps, as you might imagine. This stamp is called "The Entire Country is Red," but if you look down to the right, below China, you see that Taiwan is white. And only a few escaped the printing process before the authorities found the problem. Amazingly, the stamp designer did not get into any trouble for this. These stamps are very, very valuable, in the range of $100,000 now, if you can find one. You may not be able to find one, but you can probably find a copy. There's copies for sale too. Some of these copies are just simply copies and marked as such. Others are actual fakes, because it's fairly easy to fake a stamp for the uneducated eye these days. So as the Cultural Revolution escalated, what happened was that stamp collecting, which was suspicious during the 1950s, became an even more dangerous hobby. And finally, there had been, for example, a column on stamp collecting in China Reconstructs, which appears in many languages. It's kind of the official voice to the world of Chinese culture. It was omitted in 1968. So they had always had a section on stamp collecting. By 1968, it was completely gone. And in the same year, China Philatelic Company closed. But let's go back to the 1950s for a moment and try to figure out exactly what the problems with stamp collecting were. I think we can get more information if we look at some of the articles in China's first national level journal devoted to philately, or stamp collecting, which was published on January 1st, 1955, called Jiyo, which means stamp collecting or philately. This is quite an interesting journal, and you can get copies of this journal, or you can actually get the journal itself and make copies of the articles through the American China Stamp Society, which has a library down in California. And that's where I got most of these. It includes articles on various aspects of philately, ranging from the technical issues that I mentioned before, such as perforations or printing or identification, to historical and cultural interests as well. The articles do not just deal with Chinese stamps, they actually deal with global stamps. However, there are some qualifications there on what can be counted as an interesting stamp. Now, From the beginning of the journal in 55 through the 1960s, it periodically published articles discussing the ideological hazards for collectors who were trying to maintain a socialist approach to their hobby and on the proper way to collect stamps in a socialist country. And from the socialist point of view, there were many dangers involved in collecting stamps. And one of the jobs that GEO, this journal, took on was to help collectors wend their way through these hazards and form appropriate collecting habits. So just showing how important this concern was, the very first article of the very first issue was called Establishing a New Mood or Atmosphere in Philately, in Stamp Collecting. So that's the very first article of GEO, and that is the first thing that has to be set straight. How do you collect? We can keep collecting under a socialist political regime, but how do we do it? We have to do it in a certain way. So this was followed in the same issue by instructions on how to collect, and another one on the correct way to engage in philatelic activities, such as exchanging stamps, getting stamps, giving stamps away, and so on. Now, these articles included a discussion of attitudes toward collecting, the social practices that are involved in collecting, the nationality of the stamps and why that was important, the topics, the images, the themes, as well as technical issues. It's also interesting that articles and letters to the journal alluded to persistent problems in eradicating inappropriate ideas about philately. So this isn't just a theoretical issue. People, and especially young people, had to be informed about how to correctly collect stamps. It brings me back to when I was collecting stamps when I was young, when I was a kid, and I think we also were encouraged by philatelic literature, which we couldn't read much of, but we understood by the way that stamps were organized that there was a correct way to collect. For example, when we collected Chinese stamps when I was young, it was all from the Republic of China or Taiwan. We were not really able to collect stamps from the People's Republic of China in the 1960s. So we can now take, I think, a brief look at how the articles and letters defined inappropriate collecting. Here's one, a very short little letter called Unhealthy Trends in Stamp Collecting that was written by the organizer of a middle school stamp collecting club from Hainan Island. And this organizer complained about a letter that one of his students had received. The letter suggested a kind of pyramid scheme in which each person receiving a postcard would send out, with a stamp on it, would send out 4 others, and so on. It would go down the line. This did not seem like a good way to collect stamps to the organizer. For one thing, it was sure to result in disappointment. And for another thing, the organizer specifically said this is derived from the old society or the pre-1949 society of stamp collecting. Now, the other thing that the organizer mentioned was that the idea of getting benefits for little effort, in other words, you receive a card and you send out 4 more, mocked the value of hard work. And this hard work was held in high regard in the 1950s. And also mentioned the possibility that someone could break the chain and those down the line would not get any stamps. And this is, of course, the problem with pyramid schemes, is it's fine for those at the top, but it's not very good for those at the bottom. Now, in the next issue, the problem of trading or even buying stamps with an eye to rarity and the inevitable presence of the profit motive lurking behind this approach also was discussed. The danger of falling prey to capitalist motivation was one of the biggest problems of stamp collecting, and it was frequently addressed between 1955 and 1966 when the journal stopped publication. So here's a cartoon that also appeared in Geo in 1956. And what this cartoon shows is that the failure to separate the enemy and us, which is the title, was always a concern. So we have a collector who's assiduously studying stamps and studying one stamp there, roughly in the shape of a map of the United States, with a military figure on it that probably is a caricature of Dwight Eisenhower, because you see this image actually quite a bit being criticized and mocked in relation to Chinese stamps, and probably elsewhere as well. There's also an unscrupulous man who lurks behind there with a rope. He's going to kind of throw that rope out and snare the stamp collector. So this is really the issue of appropriate stamps and identifying which countries we could not collect stamps from. Now, the editors of Geo wrote an article called How to Handle Stamps with Reactionary Content. And so if we go back to this slide for a moment, we can see that as opposed to the Chinese stamp on the left, the stamp on the right has reactionary content. Now, that is a faux stamp. Of course, there isn't a stamp that looked exactly like that in the shape of the United States. But we'll go back to this article. So what the author wrote, this is really by the editorial board, after going through the benefits of stamp collecting, that is gaining historical and cultural knowledge being the most important of those benefits, the editors wrote that while recognizing different interests, collectors should still not collect stamps with reactionary themes and should not put them in their album. So they recognize that people may be interested in these stamps, but they don't think that they should be collected. Now, the reason is that if interest in those stamps grows, they could exert a kind of corrupting influence. I don't know what the reason was that we could not collect stamps from communist countries in the 1960s in the United States. Any kind of commerce, of course, was prohibited, so that was part of it. The stamps could not be bought. But simply having those stamps in your album during Cold War times, late Cold War times, seemed to be something that could not happen. So China's not alone in this. Now, in addition to stamps that had images of Chiang Kai-shek, other forbidden stamps were also discussed. Some were showing imperialism, showing American power, or showing erotic images. Apparently, some collectors argued that they were only interested in the aesthetics of these stamps. Some of the reactionary stamps, not the political message. But this was not accepted by the editors who cited Mao Zedong in his 1942 talks on the Yan'an Forum, at the Yan'an Forum on Art and Literature, because Mao explained something crucial about aesthetics, which is that the better the aesthetics of the reactionary item, the more convincing, and therefore the more poisonous it became. So if the aesthetics were of interest, that already was a problem. So these are some examples that I think of stamps. These were not mentioned by the editors, but these are stamps that I believe would be prohibited or strongly discouraged. So this 1943 stamp, Commemorating Equal Treaties, shows an image of Chiang Kai-shek with 3 flags: the United States, Britain, and the Republic of China. Excuse me, we have a lot of smoke in the air here. I'm sure you do too. This is an interesting stamp called the Naked Maya, and that's the philatelic name for this stamp, which came out in 1930. And this depicts a painting by Francesco de Goya. It was painted in 1800, and this stamp is part of a set marking the anniversary of the death of the Spanish artists. It's thought to be the world's first postage stamp with a nude on it. And I think this would fall into the category of lewd stamps or lewd objects. This is a very famous stamp. It's the Atoms for Peace stamp. And it shows really the globe that is being surrounded by the universal symbol for nuclear power. Atoms for Peace was the title of a speech that was delivered by the United States President Dwight D. Eisenhower for the UN Assembly, General Assembly in New York in late December of 1953. So this probably refers to American power, and it really, the image of it shows these this kind of power in the form of atoms or electrons, I guess they are, going around the world. Here's a picture of the Atoms for Peace, a stamp sheet being presented to Dwight Eisenhower. This is probably something that you can't quite imagine happening today, that a sheet of stamps being presented to the President of the United States. And finally, here's a British exhibition stamp, a commemorative stamp from 1924, which, of course, saying British Empire exhibition suggests imperialism and the British Empire. So these four stamps, I think we can talk about these four stamps. The first one, clear, it refers to Chiang Kai-shek and the Republic of China. The second one has what would be thought of as a lewd image on it. The third one refers to American power, and the fourth one refers to imperialism. So these stamps, I think, all would be prohibited. The editors, however, wanted to make it clear that they couldn't lay down any guidelines or laws about this. The problem was really one of attitude and learning. It was not something that could be readily codified. So this makes it all the more difficult, if you don't really know what is forbidden, to figure out which stamp is okay. There were greater principles, we can see, that determined how to collect stamps and to some degree which stamps to collect. And the Cold War, of course, drew the line a little bit more sharply on certain images, topics, and national origins of stamps. Indeed, attitude, framework for collecting, these are the most important things. What is your attitude and why do you collect? What do you collect? Why do you collect it? And what does collecting show about your values? And many of these articles are aimed at younger people, even though I'm sure that they also pertain to anybody who collects stamps. Adults are supposed to know. Now, this cartoon shows someone who has fallen for buying and selling over exchanging. He is sticking out of a stamp album and holding up a kind of stamp-like object. And you see below the sign is crossed out exchange, and underneath it says commerce or buying and selling. There's an abacus below that little thing, and this is there as to represent a tool of commerce. This came out in 1958, and the title is Behind Legitimate Activities. Now, in Cold War times, like I said, the United States poses a special danger, and so we can take a look at some more cartoons. So this cartoon, instead of showing what you should do, it shows what you shouldn't do. And the album, by the way, says stamp collecting on it. So he's leaping right out from the actual body of the album to show you that he's collected a stamp, probably through buying and selling. As this cartoon shows, this is from the 11th volume of Geo in 1958. Stamps can actually benefit you in the struggle against America. Can it benefit China in the struggle against America? 1958, really Cold War times. What this shows is a very strong worker depicted in socialist style with powerful hands, although they have some kinds of gloves on them, and arms. And that worker is holding a stamp-like object. This is not a real stamp, but really a faux stamp. and it features the universal symbol that we just saw for atomic power. There's down to the right, there is a small man holding a satchel full of bombs, and this he's marked, the bombs are marked, or he's marked, as well as the bombs are marked US, and he kind of looks up on in terror. That could, I don't know who that is, maybe also Dwight Eisenhower, looks on in terror as he sees this giant worker holding this stamp. Now the caption says, "A clear difference," suggesting that atomic power should be in the right hands, and showing us how the earlier American Atoms for Peace stamp could be seen as subversive. So if we put the Atoms for Peace stamp up here, and we see that there's a contrasting image. In the Chinese stamp, the globe, so the way that the thing whirls around the globe has been shrunk, the center is shrunk, and the Chinese faux stamp suggests that nuclear energy will be used for industry, as you see below there. So these are two different, these are things that were never put up against each other, but that we can put together to help us glean the meaning of this cartoon. Now, collecting any kind of stamp from Taiwan, and not just those with Chiang Kai-shek on them, also was a danger, as we see in this following cartoon, which is called "We Resolutely Reject Taiwan Stamps." And what we see are three male figures. I don't know whether or not stamp collecting in 1950s China was something that boys did more often than girls. But by the time I got to China in 1979, it seemed like girls and boys were both collecting stamps, again, with some stipulations and some limitations. So we see a very large, young, strong man with his hand out, and a boy also with a hand out, his arm out, and then a man dressed in a traditional gown who's also got his hand out. And it seems like someone, perhaps Chiang Kai-shek, is coming to invade in a very dilapidated condition. He's not really strong enough to do it, but he's coming, he's tiny even compared with the boy. He's coming to invade in the form of stamps. So the stamps themselves really lead the way here in a form of invasion. They're repulsed by the three figures. The large young man, has his foot out as well, and he's going to simply push this back. And the boy and the older man in a traditional gown with cloth shoes there are tearing the stamps up. So this shows you an image of how it was thought to be, stamp collecting was thought to be insidious, and it could bring the values in along with the stamp. So if you collected those stamps from Taiwan, you might fall prey. You had to really reject those stamps. And here we see another faux stamp. This is not a real stamp, but it is a picture of Taiwan, the island of Taiwan, with the PRC flag planted on it. And there's a poem that I've translated very roughly to the side. 6 million people have great strength to leap across the seas and liberate Taiwan. Is that 6 million or 60 million? Probably 60 million. The 5-star flag unfurls in the wind, and the people of Taiwan are smiling. Now, the making of these fake stamps, I think, is they weren't actually made. What I mean is an image was drawn up of a fake stamp and put here in these next to poetry and in the cartoons. And I think it's a very clever way of using stamps themselves to almost encompass and embody an ideological issue. And these kinds of images make it all the more convincing. 600 million, thank you. Make it all the more convincing that stamp collecting is a hobby that is related to the political debates and stances of the time. So if we take this issue, if we take an ideological issue and you make a stamp-like image, it brings urgency to collectors, because it's as if their hobby embodies issues that are important in China at the time. Now, in the 1960 issue of Geo, people from various institutions around the country, including the Beijing Post Office, the Beijing Naval Academy, Naval Institute, and the Central Arts Academy, and many others, wrote a series of articles and letters criticizing American use of stamps on behalf of Cold War ideology. This clearly was an organized campaign. I don't think this just spontaneously sprang up. I don't know how it was organized or who organized it, but what stimulated this reaction was the United Nations establishment of the International Year of the Refugee, which lasted from July 1959 to June 1960. And it was commemorated through stamps by many nations. Here we have the American stamp. And down there on the bottom right, you see it also on an envelope. It was a modernist drawing by Irvin Metzel and showed a family moving away from darkness toward light. And here on the envelope, this is a first day of issue. And you see a cachet or a little picture there on the envelope, which shows the globe and the Statue of Liberty and some refugees. Suggesting that the United States is saving the impoverished of the world and bringing liberty to the entire world. This is a cartoon from Geo that is drawn by a middle school student and shows Dwight Eisenhower under a stamp-like banner that states the Eisenhower Plan for Taking in Refugees and welcoming an injured military man into a crumbling building out of which the United States, symbolized as an assassin with a bomb, crawls out of a window. So the title of this one is Black Store or Unscrupulous Business, and suggesting that the United States is not being honest in taking in refugees, that this is a kind of performance that will be turned into something evil. Now, this cartoon was in the July 1960s issue, and the American stamp came out on April 7th, 1960, so the same year, almost a few months before. Now, maybe I'm going too far here, but it seems to me that there are some stylistic similarities between the stamp and the cartoon. You see these kind of slashing modernist lines that are turned into crumbling bricks that are slashing down in the same way along the line of the building. So this is just my imagination, but possibly this is a kind of indirect critique of that sort of image. In the first issue of 1965, leaping up a few years, there were a series of articles around the related theme of how to make stamp collecting revolutionary. This was actually discussed through all the issues of 1965 and 1966. So it's a little bit different than how do you collect properly under socialism. It goes now to a more aggressive approach, which is how can we actually make stamp collecting revolutionary? Turns out to be very difficult to do. So these topics, some of them are the same as earlier issues, and some more focused criticisms of the hobby also appear in the mid-60s. So, for example, in an article called Concerning Philately Experts, pre-1949 specialists dealing in rare stamps are attacked, and the whole issue of becoming an expert on any particular stamps or any area of stamp collecting is attacked. So, rare stamps such as the large dragon stamps from 1878, very valuable stamps now, and stamps that do take some expertise to tease out all of the different technical aspects of the stamps and how the stamps were used. The Empress Dowager birthday commemorative stamps from 1894. Or the red revenue stamps of 1897. These are all actually pulled out and discussed in some of these articles. In fact, really, collecting any stamp can be dangerous if your goal is to accumulate deep knowledge based on rarity, and thus to subtly and sort of unconsciously enter the world of commerce and capitalism, rather than to focus on scholarship about the stamps. This is a bit of a subtle difference, but we can see that once you gain knowledge of those stamps, you're in a better position to collect those stamps, which then will become valuable. So the authors also argue that anyone specializing in a certain kind of stamp or era, stamp era, is doing something wrong. This really echoes the debate in the late 1950s of China on red versus expert. And at the core of this debate is the question of to what extent can you allow those with expertise to be unconcerned with politics. So once you gain expertise, it pulls you into a different realm, and your framework or the kind of overarching idea over what you're doing starts to change. And then, does politics and the right attitude always come first? And this was an actively debated question. You can see it in many fields, not only stamp collecting. So the authors propose a solution for young collectors, which is instead of spending your time collecting, you need to carefully restrict the time that you spend on stamps, instead focusing on work and school. And the implication of this is that given enough free time, anyone will want to specialize. And nowadays, there's no way to collect stamps without specializing, because you'll just get lost in the huge body of stamps that is out there. And even you can't really even specialize on something like Chinese stamps. There's too many of them. You have to have a more limited focus. Now, many of the articles in this series compare philately in the old society with new attitudes toward collecting. Certainly, any collecting habits that elevate rarity or value are discouraged. And also what is discouraged is the search for individual glory or recognition, which can easily pop up as you're collecting and becoming known as someone who is an expert on a certain kind of stamp. We see this cartoon. This cartoon shows an image of a young man burning suspicious stamps. And it's the caption makes it clear that politics should always be in charge. There's a lot of dangers, as you can see. Now, as the hyper-politicized environment of the Cultural Revolution got closer and closer, officially starting in 1966, it became even more impossible to sustain a focus on philately. Articles on stamp collecting increasingly in the stamp collecting journal became replaced by those simply on political issues, which had always been there, but now they started to edge out the articles on stamp collecting. And it probably was dangerous to do otherwise, because images, of course, stamps, things like that are open to various interpretation. And replacing engagement with politics with a hobby such as stamp collecting was itself possibly a treacherous thing to do. So in the 6th volume of 1966, the articles are almost completely devoted to political issues, and a notice appears fastened to the binding on the first page, and it roughly reads, "Now, because of our effort, all of our effort is devoted to the Cultural Revolution, and with the approval of the higher authorities, Geo Monthly Journal will stop publication with the 7th issue of this year. Those who have paid for subscriptions can receive refunds from the post office where they subscribed." So that's the end, temporarily, of Geo Stamp Collecting Magazine. And this is the back of the same journal, the very same issue, this final issue, and it features decorative unmailed covers with commemorative cancels on them. I feel like this is a kind of summary. This back page can be viewed as a summary of the 17 years. That's the term that is now used to study this period from 1949 to 1966. It appears at the dawn of the Cultural Revolution, and these sets of stamps are actually very picturesque. They are painted in soft traditional styles, but they also show important political sites. So I feel like these stamps express both the traditional romance of aesthetically based collecting, which we did as kids. We would often collect stamps that we liked or we thought had cool pictures on them, and the sometimes conflicting need in socialist China to recognize and promote revolutionary culture. Now, people did still collect during the Cultural Revolution, even though they were worried about it and they tried to hide it. Now, I know this because when I went to Beijing University in 1979 and stayed there for 2 years, as soon as someone knew I was a stamp collector, they offered me stamps, in some cases their entire collection. So my Cultural Revolution collection, which then I can see had been collected by these students, mostly comes from people giving me stamps. This is a very selfless thing to do, to give a foreigner interested in Chinese stamps, your stamps, but it's also self-protecting, because at the time, no one knew which way the wind was going to blow. The Cultural Revolution had only been over for a few years. The official dates are 1966 to 1976. I was there in 1979. And no one knew which way or what was going to happen. Would stamp collections be evidence of bad thoughts? May as well give them to a doting foreigner like myself. It was a much safer way to think, but it was also generous, and I appreciated it. The other way I got my stamps was going to stamp trading places on the street. There was a stamp collecting corner, a stamp collecting corner. Usually I got very inferior stamps by trading American stamps. And so I never really was very successful there because I wasn't savvy to all of the tricks that were going on. One of the tricks was to put stamps in colored cellophane. And if you didn't ask for them to be taken out, you couldn't really see what was wrong with the stamp. But anyway, and a third way that I got stamps was that in that fall of 1979, there was an exhibition of all of the stamps that had been put out in China from 1949 to 1979. So it was a 30-year exhibition. And you could go to the exhibition. I rode my bike downtown and went to the exhibition. And then you could choose which stamp sets were your favorites. And you could put in ballots. And those ballots then would be tabulated. And the more people that voted for a certain set, that would determine who the winners were. It's a kind of a illogical way, but it seems illogical, but it works very well. And there turned out to be 15 winners were chosen from those who took the stamps that were voted for by most people. And I was one of those 15 winners. Very strange. I put in actually 5 ballots based on different criteria. I don't remember what those criteria are right now. Aesthetics, the ones that I thought would win, the ones that I liked the best, and 2 others. But I turned out to be one of the 15 winners. So they called my dormitory to let them know that I was one of the winners. And the dormitory, the women who were handling the phone said, "She's a foreigner." And that caused a lot of excitement. And they came to interview me. And I'm not going to put this slide up for very long because it's quite embarrassing, but they published an article, a short article about stamp collecting written by me, and a picture of me sitting in my dormitory on my bed. This was published in Geo 1980. Moving on, I also got my collection of Mao badges for the same reason. People gave me these Mao badges because they were not sure exactly whether or not it was okay to collect these things. At the time when I was a student at Beijing University from 1979 to 81, some of the more Marxist attending European students learned that I was collecting these Mao badges and criticized me for having the wrong attitude toward collecting. And what they said was that these were collected out of admiration and love, and I was collecting them as a capitalist collector. Now, I'm going to end up with the same image that I started out with. This is another story and a sheet of stamps. You can see that those are the stamp sheet of the stamps that I had put up before. And these are the ceremony, the national ceremony, and on them says Mao Zedong and the date. And the way that this came about was that after the actual celebratory parade and gathering in Tiananmen on National Day in 1959, someone named Yang Xiaoming, who is the son of Yang Shangqun, who was later the president of China, approached Mao and asked him to sign some of the stamps. Now, Mao did not really want to do it because he said if he put his signature on it, it would ruin the stamps. But eventually he agreed and signed the stamps. And this is really now a part of philatelic history. And this image appears on the December 1983 cover of Geo, Philately, which started up publication again. Now, possibly Yang Xiaoming wasn't thinking about rarity or commerce when he asked Mao to sign these, but I have some doubts whether or not he was thinking of that. In any case, I want to summarize just briefly what the issues are with collecting stamps in the 1950s. Basically, this was a battle between non-commercial, anti-capitalist values of socialism and the socialist values that were kind of always there as part of capitalist collecting as well, or can we say collecting under capitalism as well. You know, the interest in the history of the stamp, the interest in the culture. But I think under, you know, unless you're a young child, under capitalism, you always wonder about the rarity of a stamp, and you're always trying to buy a good stamp that's going to be valuable in the future, as well as just collecting stamps for themselves. So the problems are then allowing oneself to become enamored of stamps with questionable images or implications, identifying rarity with an eye to expertise or commerce, and buying or selling as opposed to exchanging. And it's not just stamps. Any kind of collecting can be criticized from this perspective. But socialist collecting sometimes reminds me of the way we collected stamps as children for fun, just learning about different countries, sometimes under wacky collecting principles such as color or common images, which is like horses or cars or whatever. Edward Schaefer gave me a very well-known professor who passed away some years ago at Berkeley, and he studied Tang Dynasty poetry. He gave me his collection of stamps, global stamps, which was nude women, collected each one put on a separate page, and he had drawn lines around it. So even an adult can collect that way if they don't want to be part of the more professional type of stamp collecting. And this is, of course, this way of stamp collecting is quite different from the values of the technical focus, which can drive the issue of rarity. So the real question then is, to what extent do stamp collectors turn their hobby into something that can be monetized? And then to what extent does this approach, this monetization, influence their collecting? It's thought to be a circular process, and that's why many different kinds of images appear, suggesting that there's real dangers inherent in stamp collecting if the stamp collectors are not aware. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much. Let's see.
Great. Thank you so much, Wendy. What a great subject. We do have some questions in our Q&A box. Just as a reminder to all of our attendees, if you do have a question, please use the Q&A box. You can access that by clicking on the little speech bubble icon that says Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It opens up a little window, type in your question, and then when you're done, you can also close that. Or if you have more questions, feel free to type in some more. If you really can't figure that out, feel free to also use the chat screen to ask questions. And I think let's go ahead. Wendy, you ready?
Yes, I am.
Excellent. Okay. So our first question is, what was the attitude toward philately in other socialist countries, and was it viewed with suspicion in some non-communist countries as well?
So in the first part, yes, most socialist countries had similar problems with stamp collecting. We do have to remember Cold War ideology, which made a very sharp break, a very sharp line between socialist and non-socialist countries. So I would say that stamp collecting in the Soviet Union, which was an active hobby, was also fell under the same kinds of problems. But I don't know to what extent it was actually discussed, because I haven't studied that. You also have in China, which you wouldn't have in the Soviet Union, you have the problem of Taiwan. So these are Chinese stamps that have to be taken with great care, studied with great care, and cannot really be part of anyone's collection in 1950s PRC. As for the latter question, I tried to hint at that a little bit during my talk, is yes, I think that those kinds of issues were going on when I was a child too. So we couldn't collect stamps from Cuba or from China, from any socialist country. We could not collect stamps. But I don't think it was much discussed. It was just simply there. And maybe that's because I was young and I wasn't reading the material, but I've looked into it a little bit. And it's just simply accepted that any country, late 50s, 1960s, that the United States does not have relationships with, and especially socialist countries under Cold War conditions, you cannot collect stamps for. So there certainly is a parallel situation to some degree.
Great. We have another question. This one says, could you comment on the fact that today China and the US produce a joint issue each year celebrating Chinese New Year?
Yeah, that's really an interesting topic. I don't know how that came about, but right now, of course, there's no problem with collecting Chinese stamps, or in fact, any stamps in the world. I don't know, I don't think, okay, I don't really know whether or not you can buy North Korean stamps in America now, but I certainly bought a set when I was in China and brought them back with no problem. So I think, you know, partially, we can think of stamps as they're national and they're also global. So stamps carry images and make connections that a national government wants to make. There are a lot of people who submit designs to the Postal Service, and there are contests to take these designs. I don't know how. There probably was some kind of a committee that decided that, you know, the U.S. and China now had good relations. The New Year stamp and these kinds of New Year images, the animals and whatnot, seems harmless, and so let's go ahead and put out a stamp like that. But I don't know much more about it. Okay, Michael says you can buy North Korea stamps now in the U.S. Okay, well, that's good to know. Okay.
Right. Another question about jointly issued stamps is, did China issue stamps jointly during the Cultural Revolution?
Not to my knowledge. I don't think so. I think there were only Chinese stamps. And, you know, if you want to find out what year these stamps were, you can't look down at the bottom and figure it out. You have to actually look at some kind of stamp collecting material to figure it out. I'm not, by the way, I'm not really, like I said, I'm a dilettante. I'm not a specialist. So if I said anything wrong about stamps, I hope Michael will jump in again, because I really don't know that much about the technical issues of stamps.
Okay. All right. How about Russian stamps? Were they accepted for collecting in China?
Yes, and in fact, stamps from socialist countries were really one of the topics that Geo published articles on all the way through the 50s. Now, as the relationship between China and the Soviet Union started to disintegrate in the early 60s, that became problematic. And so although stamps could still be collected, from the number of articles about Soviet stamps went down. But all of the Soviet countries, or all of the, socialist countries were considered fine, and really they set up models for what stamps could be collected and what kind of topics were appropriate. There's quite a number of articles on this in Geo.
Great. Another question is, I'm curious what you retorted to the students who criticized your collecting interests. Did you debate the values or ideas these Marxists presented about stamp collecting?
I don't think I did. I think I just responded in a very horrible manner, probably, or maybe I didn't respond at all. Maybe saying something like, well, that's what you believe, but I don't believe that. So I didn't engage very much, and this was really only a few people. I also want to say that no Chinese person ever said this to me. And I think that China has a long traditional culture of collecting, and that those values still stayed there, even as they were kind of being discarded. That bird collecting and art collecting and other kinds of collecting. What I did talk with Chinese students about was whether or not it was okay to collect a whole bunch of Mao badges, for example, and they said it was best to be a bit restrained in one's collecting and not to show too many, because that kind of accumulation would be problematic. The European students, it was just a few students, they didn't want to talk to me anymore after they found out I was collecting Mao badges. They didn't know about the stamps.
Wow. Okay. We've got a few more questions. The next one is, did the monetary aspect of collecting, with an eye to rare and value, ever become acceptable? Would you tell us your criteria for collecting stamps?
Yes, it did become acceptable. I think it really was simply submerged during this whole period, and it was always there because people did collect sheets of stamps that they never used, and they just kept them in hiding to some degree, to the degree that they could. People during the Cultural Revolution who collected stamps, if they were in Hong Kong, for example, they could collect all kinds of stamps, and they did collect them in Hong Kong. And what we're seeing now is that little by little, these stamps are coming out and coming onto the market. Certainly by now, by 1980, mid-80s, collecting underwent a transformation, and the same kind of values that we see here were adopted. So yes, they were collected with an eye to rarity, with an eye to expertise. Expertise on stamp collecting is and on stamps in general is very deep in China now. My criteria, it's kind of embarrassing, but I don't like to spend a lot of money on stamps, so I like the treasure hunt aspect of it. I'm always begging people to give me stamps. If they're valuable, I'll give them back. But I don't really go and buy stamps at auction or anything like that. I just find what I can, however I can. What happened after this publication of my article is that people sent me stamps. People from all over China wrote letters. I still have the letters. I have boxes and boxes of these letters from all over China. Some of them were quite poignant and talked about difficulties and how they wanted to make friends with a foreigner or have some kind of place where they could talk, something that they could talk about that was relatively safe. And they sent me stamps. So people sent me stamps. So I collected a lot of stamps that way as well.
That's great. I think you're going to be encouraging some stamp collecting in our audience.
Well, if you don't want stamps, send them to me.
Excellent. Our next question is, can you comment further on the transition between leading into the Cultural Revolution, where the stamp collecting was encouraged, and then having to hide the collecting hobby?
I'm not sure exactly what the questioner means by reading further into that. A lot of things during the Cultural Revolution were hidden. A lot of people hid valuable items if they could. If they were living in a large urban area and had relatives in the countryside, they would often take those things there out to the countryside and try to hide them. They hid them under boards, in walls, all kinds of things like that. Depending on who you were, it could be dangerous to be caught by Red Guards with the wrong kind of things in your possession. All Western things were suspicious. So if you had, for example, Western literature, unless it came, I don't know if you call, they didn't call Soviet literature or even earlier Russian literature Western. But if you were caught with that kind of materials, you could, those would be confiscated and you could be punished. So I'm not sure if that answers the question or not.
It was just if you had any further comments on it, so that was great.
Well, the one more comment is that, there was, when people gave me these stamps in 1979, 80, 81, they weren't sure. I mean, a lot of these stamps had Mao's image on them, and they weren't sure whether or not it was a good thing or a bad thing to keep these stamps. So I think, that kind of ambivalence or ambiguity, where, like, one thing I mentioned in my talk is that they didn't, by saying, here's the things we're talking about, but we're not going to make it a guideline or a rule. We're going to leave it up to you to think about this and educate yourself. That kind of movement actually was very confusing for people because they didn't know what was right or wrong, and when something that had been right the day before would switch into something that was wrong.
Right. We have a follow-up question to that, and it is, what were people expected to do when the stamps were no longer approved, and what did they actually do? Which I think
they were supposed to destroy them, certainly not share them with somebody. They were supposed to destroy them, because if you shared them with someone or gave them away, that only contributed to the problem going on in perpetuity.
Okay. Our next question is, when did Western people start collecting PRC stamps, and by which channels?
I think, the European countries that set up relationship with China, those countries, you can see, even stamp collectors would write letters to people in China, or they had friends who were collecting in China. So if you had an early relation, some of the European countries had relationships much earlier than the United States, which was 1979. And you can see that they asked for envelopes with certain stamps on them to be sent. So they were certainly collecting then. I'm sure collecting was going on all through the 50s and 60s as well, even though maybe the direct connection was not as good. Michael writes here that Canada allowed the importing of PRC stamps, and if Canada got them, then we could get them too. So people would do it by an indirect method. There's a lot of these stamps now on the market that you can see. By the way, I didn't address the problem of counterfeited stamps, which are now rampant. So that's another reason I hesitate to buy stamps. I like buying stamps on eBay, where you can get collections for relatively cheap, and then look through them and find the stamps you want, and then give away the others or sell them again. But unless you really know what you're doing, you shouldn't go buying these expensive stamps, some of the Cultural Revolution stamps, because it's easy to get taken in. There's one story that was in one of the articles that I didn't relate to you, which is that a young stamp collector related the time when he got interested in stamps that were either had errors on them or were colored in a different way. And the stamp errors is, of course, a big part of stamp collecting, because they're rare and therefore they become more valuable. They're usually rare. And what this collector did is saved up his money and spent a lot of money to get a stamp that was colored in the wrong way, thinking it was a bona fide error. And it turned out that, of course, what the dealer had done is simply change the color of the stamp by using some kind of a chemical formulation. And the kid found out about this later, and then this taught him that he had to collect it by socialist values, not looking at for rarity or something like that. It was kind of an interesting story.
We have a lovely question here with a great story from Susan Holm. She says, thanks very much for the fascinating talk. In the late 80s, I discovered a large government-run store, maybe it was a post office, on Nanjing Road in Shanghai that sold uncanceled historic Chinese stamps. I had great fun purchasing many stamps there and believe they sold stamps from as far back as the 1960s. Were stores like this common throughout China in the late 70s and 80s? And is there anything similar in China today?
Yes, absolutely. They were becoming common in the early 80s. I mean, in the mid 80s, they started to become more common. And today there are stamp stores like that, but more stamp trading goes on online. Buying and selling goes on online now because you get a much bigger audience. So it's almost shifted entirely to online. If you manage to collect the stamp called the Golden Monkey, the red stamp with a black monkey on it from 1980, I believe, hang on to that. That's a valuable stamp. It's weird, but in stamp collecting, sometimes for no reason other than people like a certain image, a stamp will become coveted. And so when I was there, I collected this stamp, and I have a few copies of it, but I wasn't smart enough to see that this was going to be a valuable stamp, and therefore I should have bought a few sheets of this stamp, which only cost 8 fun at the time.
Okay, we are nearing the end of our Q&A session, and we've got a couple of questions left. If you have any more, feel free to keep entering them in, and we'll see if we can fit them in our last few minutes. The next question is, did Zoe and Lai appear on stamps?
Did Zoe and Lai? Yes. Zoe and Lai is on several stamps, actually. And there's also a collection of Zoe and Lai stamps from early 80s, maybe late 70s, early 80s, where his image, there's many different images of him in the series after he passed away. And so he did appear on many stamps, actually, yes. But on the Cultural Revolution stamps, of course, it's predominantly Mao that appears.
And the follow-up question to that is, did he, I guess, was he still on the stamps when he fell out of favor?
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
The question says, and when he fell out of favor,
Mm-hmm.
referring to Zoe and Lai, was he still on stamps?
No, he disappeared at that time. And so there you have the issue of, sometimes stamps would come out and they were inappropriate a year later. And so a revision would be made and the stamp would come out differently. There's a note here from Michael Bloom asking me to mention introduction to stamp collecting. The best way to get your introduction is to join the American Philatelic Society, which is the world's largest collection, or rather largest society of stamp collectors. And you can look at it at www.stamps.org. And Michael is actually a director in that, so he is a real serious stamp collector, as opposed to me, the dilettante.
Okay, so we've finished all the questions in our Q&A box. I'd like to give the audience one more chance to, if you have any other questions, to go ahead. And let's see. Oh, there's one. Love it. The question is, in 1993 in Shanghai, I would visit a tiny out-of-the-way park on weekends where there were a couple dozen middle-aged and old men covertly selling stamps and Mao badges. Just a comment there.
Okay, yeah, all right. And then
oh, I'm sorry. And then the follow-up is, would they have been in trouble if caught?
No, I don't think so. I think by 1993, was that the date? Yeah, I think by then it was probably becoming okay. But I mean, the older you were, the more you knew about how these things had changed quickly, sometimes turning on a dime. And, you know, the metaphor in Chinese is the way the wind blows. You never know if the wind is going to change its direction. So they would be very, very cautious. One of the experiences that I had in China was running into a professor who had written a well-known textbook on a train. She was a Westerner, and talking to her, and she had been imprisoned in the early 1950s in China after she decided to stay. And she just told me to be careful at every single moment. And honestly, going to China in 1979, nothing like that was in my mind at all. And she warned me very seriously, don't take anything at face value. Things can change very, very quickly. So I think older collectors probably do become a little bit cautious, even as late as 1993.
Great. So it looks like there are no more questions. So again, thank you, Wendy. Just wanted to offer you a chance if you had any final comments or remarks, you're welcome to say them.
I just want to thank everyone for coming under very difficult conditions. I know you're all smoked out just like we are here and on top of the coronavirus. And so I appreciate you logging on and listening to this talk. Thank you.
Great. And thank you for coming to our speaking with us, Wendy. For everybody, thank you so much for attending. If you have more questions, you are welcome to send them to our email. We can try to get some follow-up on that. The email is on the screen, but it's First Saturday PDX @gmail.com. And you're also welcome to email us with any other just questions about our programs or any comments. We welcome all of that. Our next presentation is October, and it is titled Myriad Treasures, Celebrating the Renovation and Reinstallation of the Sarong Gallery of Chinese Art. And that's presented by Anne Rose Kitagawa of the University of Oregon. Information will be on the website and will be out through email, and we'll have that registration up and running soon for you guys. I hope you enjoyed today's talk, and thank you again so much. Yeah, I hope that you all stay safe and well during this little crazy time, and we'll see you next month.